let's move on to preserving your circulation. A noted 17th century physician was quoted as saying, "A man is as old as his arteries." Women are too, though few seem to recognize it. A nationally representative survey of U.S. women found that most considered their greatest personal health risk to be cancer. Only 13% correctly identified cardiovascular disease, which is the actual leading killer of women and men and centenarians. Sadly, between 2009 and 2019, American Heart Association surveys have noted a concerning decline in the proportion of women who understood heart disease to be their leading cause of death. A recent editorial in the journal Aging Medicine rhapsodized that the blood vessel is the candle of life, boldly asserting that all diseases stems from vessels. There's even a microcirculatory theory of aging that suggests the loss of blood vessel density as we age, by as much as 50% in some tissues, such as areas of the brain, may be contributing to organ deterioration as the removal of waste and the delivery of oxygen and nutrients are impaired. You could say that what brings us blood brings us life. How to boost your EPCs. How can we remain young at heart? The capacity of our blood vessels to repair themselves is dependent on endothelial progenitor cells that emerge from stem cells in our bone marrow to patch up any holes in our endothelium, the innermost lining of our blood vessels that keeps our blood flowing smoothly. Watch c.nf/EPC for a demonstration of the power of endothelial progenitor cells and what we can do to increase their number and function, such as avoiding even secondhand cigarette smoke and getting regular aerobic exercise, considered a first-line strategy for helping to prevent and treat arterial aging. What about diet? Our randomized controlled trials show that reducing intake of saturated fat, mostly butter, significantly elevated endothelial progenitor cell numbers, consistent with a study on baboons showing that even a few weeks of a high-cholesterol, high-fat diet could cause dramatic premature endothelial cell senescence. Individual foods that have been shown to increase circulating endothelial progenitor cells include berries, onions, and green tea. And a diet centered completely around whole foods not only showed a boost in endothelial progenitors, but an improvement in endothelial function, along with a drop in LDL cholesterol. A normal cholesterol level is a deadly cholesterol level. Scientific consensus panels going back decades established beyond a reasonable doubt that lowering LDL cholesterol reduces the risk of heart attacks. Consistent evidence unequivocally establishes that LDL causes our number one killer, heart disease. This evidence base includes hundreds of studies involving literally millions of people. In other words, it's the cholesterol, stupid, quipped American Journal of Cardiology editor-in-chief William Clifford Roberts. His CV is more than 100 pages long, and he's published about 1,700 articles in the peer-reviewed medical literature. Yes, there are at least 10 traditional risk factors for atherosclerosis, but, as Dr. Roberts notes, only one is required for the progression of the disease, elevated cholesterol. All the other factors, such as smoking, high blood pressure, diabetes, inactivity, obesity, merely exacerbate the damage caused by high cholesterol. Phew! You say, because your blood work just came back and your doctor said your cholesterol is, quote-unquote, normal. But hold on. Having a normal cholesterol in a society where it's normal to drop dead of a heart attack isn't necessarily something to celebrate. With heart disease, the top killer of men and women, we definitely don't want to have normal cholesterol levels. We want to have optimal levels. And not, quote-unquote, optimal by arbitrary laboratory standards, but optimal for human health. Normal LDL cholesterol levels are associated with the buildup of atherosclerotic plaques in our arteries, even in those with so-called optimal risk factors by current standards, blood pressure under 120/80, normal blood sugars, and total cholesterol under 200. If you went to your doctor with those kinds of numbers, you'd get a gold star. But when ultrasound and CT scans were used to actually peek inside the bodies of patients boasting those numbers, overt atherosclerotic plaques were detected in 38%. Maybe those digits ain't so optimal after all. Perhaps we should define an LDL cholesterol level as optimal only when it no longer causes disease. What a concept. How can we go about figuring that out? When more than 1,000 men and women in their 40s were scanned, most of those with quote-unquote normal LDL levels under 130 had frank atherosclerosis. No atherosclerotic plaques were found only when LDL was down around 50 or 60, which just so happens to be the level most people had before our diets changed to what they are today. The majority of the global adult population had LDLs around 50 milligrams per deciliter, so average values today are regarded as normal based on a sick society. What we want is a cholesterol level that's normal for the human species, which is considered to be around 30 to 70 milligrams per deciliter, or 0.8 to 1.8 millimoles per liter. Although an LDL cholesterol in this range might seem excessively low by modern American standards, it's precisely the normal range for individuals living the lifestyle and eating the diet for which our ancient ancestors were genetically adapted over millions of years, a diet centered around whole plant foods. Given that the LDL cholesterol our body was designed for is less than half of what is presently considered quote-unquote normal, it's no wonder that we are awash in a pandemic of atherosclerotic heart disease. Why is there a tendency in medicine to accept small changes in risk factors when the goal shouldn't be just decreasing risk but preventing plaques from forming in the first place? In that case, how low should we go? As one noted professor of vascular biochemistry noted, quote, in light of the latest evidence from trials exploring the benefits and risk of profound LDL cholesterol lowering, the answer to the question, how low should we go, is arguably a straightforward, as low as you can, exclamation point, unquote. How we get there, though, matters. Lower may indeed be better, but if we're lowering our LDL with drugs, then we need to balance the benefit with the risk of pharmaceutical side effects. There's a reason we don't try to drug everyone with statins by putting them in the water supply. Yes, it would be great if everyone's cholesterol was lower, but the drugs themselves have countervailing risks. So doctors aim to use statins at the highest dose possible to achieve the largest LDL cholesterol reduction possible, without increasing the risk of muscle damage the drugs may cause. Statins also increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. However, when you use healthy lifestyle changes to bring down cholesterol, all you get are the benefits, including a significant drop in diabetes risk. But can you get your LDL low enough with only your diet? Ask some of the country's top cholesterol experts what levels they shoot for, and odds are you'll hear something like an LDL under 70 or so. Just cutting down on the saturated and trans fats found in meat, dairy, and junk, as well as reducing intake of dietary cholesterol found mostly in eggs, is unlikely to get most people to the target. However, those eating completely plant-based diets can average an LDL that low. It's no wonder plant-based diets are the only dietary patterns ever proven to reverse the progression of coronary heart disease. A sidebar, pressure points. A similar quote-unquote normal as deadly paradigm exists for blood pressure. We know the leading risk factor for death in the United States is the American diet, with tobacco number 2, but killer number 3 is high blood pressure, also known as hypertension. It's so deadly because it increases your risk of dying from so many different diseases, from heart disease and stroke to heart and kidney failure. Check out my video c.nf/blood pressure for an evolution of the guidelines, but basically, there's an exponential increase in risk of dying from a stroke or heart disease as our blood pressures go up, starting from around 110/70. Forcing pressures that low with drugs could have unacceptable consequences, though. For example, if high-risk individuals are given enough drugs at high enough doses to lower their blood pressure even down to a top number of 120 or so, more than 100,000 deaths and 46,000 cases of heart failure might be prevented every year. At the same time, this would be expected to cause, for example, 43,000 cases of electrolyte abnormalities and 88,000 cases of acute kidney injury. You can see the conundrum that guidelines committees face. On the one hand, lowering blood pressure is good for your heart, kidneys, and brain, but at a certain point, the side effects from the drugs could outweigh the benefits. Ideally, we want to get patients' blood pressures as low as possible, but we may only want to use drugs to do it, quote, when the effects of treatment are likely to be less destructive than the elevated blood pressure, unquote. The problem is that most people who die from heart disease, heart failure, and stroke may be in the borderline range, at risk, but not sufficiently elevated to warrant drug treatment. If only there was some way to lower blood pressures without drugs to get the best of both worlds. Thankfully, there are. Regular aerobic exercise, weight loss, smoking cessation, increased dietary fiber intake, decreased alcohol intake, consumption of a more plant-based diet, and cutting down on salt. The advantage is not limited to the lack of bad side effects. Lifestyle interventions like plant-based diets can actually work better than drugs because you're treating the underlying cause. It can actually have beneficial side effects. Lower for longer. In the standard American diet, atherosclerosis, the hardening of our arteries, can start when we're just teenagers. Investigators collected about 3,000 sets of coronary arteries and aortas, the main artery in the body, from accident, homicide, and suicide victims aged 15 to 34, and found fatty streaks in teens, which can turn to atherosclerotic plaques when we're in our 20s, and get worse in our 30s before they start killing us off. How many of the teens, though? All of them. 100% of the teenage victims had fatty streaks building up inside their arteries. All of them had the first stage of the disease, and those streaks were already blossoming into atherosclerotic plaques bulging into the arteries of 55 to 65% of those in their early 30s. It's chilling, I know, to realize that most people in their early 30s already have plaques in their arteries. In other words, most of you probably have heart disease, whether you know it or not. The researchers conclude with the line, quote, atherosclerosis begins in youth, unquote. If you had diabetes, would you wait until you started going blind to start treating it? With heart disease, you can't just wait until you become symptomatic, because your first symptom may be your last. For the majority of Americans who die from heart disease, the first symptom is called sudden cardiac death. An ounce of prevention is worth much more than a pound of cure because there is no cure for dead. How do you prevent atherosclerotic heart disease? By lowering your LDL cholesterol through a diet that is sufficiently low in saturated fat and cholesterol, that is, one that restricts meat, junk, dairy, and eggs. Is such a radical proposal totally impractical? Asked a review in the Journal of the American Heart Association. It would take a quote-unquote all-out commitment, but the reviewers evoked the successful public health triumph of slashing smoking rates and lung cancer deaths to argue that anything is possible. What evidence do we have that a lifelong suppression of LDL will prevent heart disease? There is a genetic mutation of a gene called PCSK9 that about 1 in 50 African Americans are lucky to be born with because it gives them about 40% lower cholesterol levels throughout their whole lives. This gives them dramatically lower rates of coronary artery disease, a whopping 88% drop in risk, despite otherwise ominous risk factors. Most with the mutation had pre-existing conditions, such as high blood pressure, being overweight or a smoker, or having diabetes. But that all just goes to show that a lifelong history of reduced LDL cholesterol levels significantly lowers the risk of coronary heart disease, even in the presence of multiple other risk factors. This near 90% drop in cardiac events, like heart attacks or sudden death, occurred only at an average LDL of 100 milligrams per deciliter, compared to 138 milligrams per deciliter in those without the mutation. With drugs or diet, you could easily achieve an LDL even lower than that. But wait, why does the lowering of LDL cholesterol by about 40 points in those with the lucky mutation reduce the incidence of coronary heart disease by nearly 90%? Whereas the same 40-point drop with a statin drug would reduce coronary heart disease prevalence by only about 20%. The most likely answer is duration. The longer the arteries are exposed to higher LDL levels in the blood, the more cholesterol can accumulate within the artery wall and inflame it. Just as tobacco exposure is measured in pack years, the amount smoked multiplied over time, an editorial in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology introduced the concept of cholesterol years to take into account the full extent to which our arteries have been bathing in it. This explains why the indigenous Tsimane, the farmers in Bolivia I mentioned before, are practically free of coronary artery disease at an average LDL of only around 90. An 80-year-old Tsimane appears to possess the vascular age of an American in their mid-50s. When it comes to lowering LDL, it's not only how low, but how long. And the lower, the longer the better. If you're being treated with drugs later in life, you may have to get your LDL under 70 milligrams per deciliter to halt the progression of atherosclerosis. But if we start early enough in life, it may be sufficient to lower LDL to only about 100, which is consistent with country-by-country data that suggests heart disease would bottom out at a population average of about 100. That's why healthy lifestyle choices may wipe out 90% or so of our risk for having a heart attack, whereas drugs may only reduce it by 20 to 30%. But that 90% is only if you can keep it down your whole life. If you're using drugs late in life to try to stop the progression of your disease, you have to get your LDL under 70, but in order to reverse a lifetime of bad food choices with drugs, you probably have to get it down to around 55. And if your heart disease is so bad you've already had a heart attack and you're trying not to die from another one, ideally, you might need to get your LDL pushed down to about 30. Once you get that low, not only would you prevent any new atherosclerotic plaques, but you'd help stabilize the plaques you already have so they'd be less likely to burst open and kill you. How effective are statins? Why cut down on any foods when you can just take a pill? I discussed the efficacy of statin drugs in depth in c.nf/statins. The absolute risk reduction is only about 1%, so for every 100 people who take a drug like Lipitor for a few years, only one person averts a heart attack. However, in order to take a cholesterol-lowering drug every day, most say they want an absolute risk reduction of at least 25 times higher than that. So the dirty little secret is if patients knew the truth, if they knew how little these drugs actually worked, nearly no one would agree to take them. A study on patient expectations titled Are Preventive Drugs Preventive Enough? Concluded that this suggests, quote, at best a lack of discussion and patient education, and at worst, a degree of misinformation on the benefits of these drugs, unquote. This sounds terribly paternalistic, but hundreds of thousands of lives are at stake. Quite simply, if patients were told the truth, a lot of people would die. More than 30 million Americans are on statins. Even if the drug saved 1 in 100, that could mean hundreds of thousands of lives lost if everyone stopped taking them. As a paper titled The Preventive Pill Paradox concluded, quote, it is ironic that informing patients about statins would increase the very outcomes they were designed to prevent, unquote. Sidebar, are statins right for you? If you have a history of heart disease or stroke, taking a statin drug is recommended, period, full stop. If you do not have any known cardiovascular disease, then the decision should be based on calculating your own personal risk, which can easily be done online if you know your cholesterol and blood pressure numbers. See, for example, the American College of Cardiology Risk Estimator, which is at c.nf/ACC, the Framingham Risk Profiler at c.nf/Framingham, or the Reynolds Risk Score at c.nf/Reynolds, REYNOLDS. I prefer the American College of Cardiology's estimator because it not only gives you your current 10-year risk, but also your lifetime risk. Under the current guidelines, if your 10-year risk is below 5%, then you should just stick to diet, exercise, and smoking cessation to further bring down your numbers, unless there are extenuating circumstances. If your 10-year risk hits 20% or higher, the recommendation is to add a statin drug on top of lifestyle modification. Between 5 and 7.5%, the tendency is to adhere to lifestyle interventions unless you have risk-enhancing factors, and between 7.5 and 20%, most lean towards adding drugs. Risk-enhancing factors your doctor should take into account when helping you make the decision include a family history of heart disease or stroke, really high LDL, like 160 or higher, metabolic syndrome, chronic kidney or inflammatory conditions, and persistently high triglycerides greater than 175 milligrams per deciliter, C-reactive protein equal to or greater to 2 milligrams per liter, or an Lp(a) greater or equal to 50 milligrams per deciliter, which I'll talk about later. If you're still not sure if you should take statins, the American Heart Association guidelines suggest consider getting a coronary artery calcium score, although the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has explicitly said that the current evidence is insufficient to conclude that the harms of the test outweigh the benefits, even though the radiation exposure is relatively low these days. How safe are statins? Studies show that as many as 75% of people stop taking statins prescribed to them. When asked why, most former statin users cited muscle pain as the primary reason for discontinuing the pills. Up to 72% of all side effects of statins are muscle symptoms associated with the drug. Taking coenzyme Q10 supplements as a treatment for statin-associated muscle symptoms seemed like a good idea in theory, but failed to actually help when put to the test. Normally, the symptoms go away after you stop the drug, but they can sometimes linger for a year or more. Muscle-related side effects could also be coincidental or psychosomatic and have nothing to do with the drug. Many clinical trials show that such side effects are rare, though it's also possible that those same trials, funded by the drug companies themselves, underrecorded the side effects. However, even in big pharma-funded trials that attributed only a small minority of symptoms to statins, researchers found that those taking the drugs were significantly more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than those randomized to placebo pills. Why? We're still not exactly sure, but statins may have a double whammy effect of impairing insulin secretion from the pancreas and also diminishing insulin's effectiveness by increasing insulin resistance. Tragically, this elevated risk persists for years even after statins are stopped. A sidebar, what about red yeast rice supplements? Red yeast rice supplements, which contain a statin-producing mold, are not recommended, as dramatic variations in the active components have been found, for example, 100-fold differences in lovastatin levels. Also, a third of retail red yeast rice supplements tested were contaminated by a potential kidney-damaging fungal toxin called citrinin. An updated 2021 analysis found citrinin exceeding safety levels in 97% of sampled supplements, including supplements labeled citrinin-free, posing a quote-unquote serious health concern. In view of the benefits of statins in the reduction of cardiovascular events, our top killer, any increase in the risk of diabetes, which is typically our seventh leading cause of death, eighth with COVID, would be outweighed by the cardiovascular benefits. Statin users would be expected to develop an extra 2 cases of diabetes per 1,000 patient years, during which time 6.5 cardiovascular events such as heart attacks or strokes would be prevented. Of course, that's a false dichotomy. We don't have to choose between heart disease and diabetes. We can treat the cause of both with the same diet and lifestyle changes. The diet that doesn't only stop the progression of heart disease but reverses it is the very same way of eating that can reverse type 2 diabetes into remission. A healthy enough plant-based diet may prevent further major cardiac episodes in as many as 99.4% of patients with significant heart disease. Sidebar, what about PCSK9 inhibitors? Extrapolating data from graphs from large cholesterol-lowering trials suggests that the incidence of cardiovascular events like heart attacks would approach 0 if LDL cholesterol can be brought below 60 in patients who had never had a heart attack and down around 30 for those trying to prevent another one. Is it even safe to have cholesterol levels that low? We didn't really know until PCSK9 inhibitors were invented. If you remember, PCSK9 is the gene that gave people lifelong low LDL. Drug companies were inspired by the natural mutation to target the gene pharmacologically. Check out c.nf/PCSK9, the numeral 9, for a full discussion. But basically, on PCSK9 inhibitors, people can achieve an LDL below 40 milligrams per deciliter and sometimes even under 15. The risk of heart attacks falls in a straight line as LDL gets lower and lower, even down below 10, without apparent health concerns, such as impairments of the synthesis of adrenal, ovarian, or testicular hormones that the body makes from cholesterol. We can take comfort in the fact that those with extreme PCSK9 mutations, which lead to a reduction in levels of LDL cholesterol to below 20 their whole lives, remain healthy and have healthy kids. There's another type of genetic mutation that leaves people with LDLs of about 30 throughout their lives, and they're known to have an exceptionally long life expectancy. Mutations that affect cholesterol are in fact what cause the so-called longevity syndromes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that drugs are safe. The bottom line is that we should try to get our LDL cholesterol down as low as we can, but much longer follow-up data are necessary anytime a new class of drugs is introduced. So far so good, but we're only a few years out. We didn't know, for instance, that statins increased diabetes risk until a decade after they had been approved and millions had already been exposed. It's also worth mentioning that PCSK9 inhibitors cost about $14,000 a year. The Great Stent Scam. Besides personal habits and biases, another reason lifestyle efforts are often neglected may be the preoccupation many cardiologists have with all the fancy gadgets and new procedures out there. Some might feel as if they've been trained to be highly skilled fighter pilots ready to go into combat with high-tech weaponry, but then are asked to go on some boring preventative diplomatic mission instead. Beyond missing an opportunity to treat the underlying cause, certain common cardiology practices have been shown to do more harm than good. This is not to pick on cardiologists. Many current medical practices have been found to offer potential harms with no benefit. Physicians themselves estimate that about a fifth of medical care is unnecessary. My 7-part video series on stents and angioplasty starts with c.nf/stents. The bottom line, during a heart attack, placing stents can be life-saving, but hundreds of thousands of these procedures are done for stable angina, meaning on a non-emergency basis. It was thought they would relieve symptoms, but they don't actually prolong life or reduce the risk of having a heart attack in the future compared to so-called medical therapy, which includes lifestyle interventions and taking statins. As the Harvard Heart Letter put it, stents are for pain, not protection. But then it was discovered in a famous double-blind randomized controlled trial that stents may not even help with pain. Hold on. A double-blind randomized controlled trial involving surgery? And in a drug trial, you can give study participants a placebo sugar pill so they won't know if they're in the active treatment group or the control group. But wouldn't you notice if someone cut into your groin? Not if you got sham surgery. Yes, placebo surgery is a thing. In the study, the researchers cut into every subject, threaded up the catheter, then did or did not place the actual stent. And those who got the sham surgery experienced the same pain relief as those who got the real surgery. If heart attacks are caused by blocked arteries, then why doesn't physically opening them up help? Because most heart attacks are caused by narrowings blocking less than 70% of your arteries, so the killer plaques don't tend to show up on angiograms. Before rupture, these plaques often don't limit blood flow, so they're invisible on angiography and stress tests. The most dangerous lesions may therefore not be amenable to angioplasty and stents, which do nothing to modify the underlying disease process itself. Treating the cause. To dramatically lower LDL cholesterol, we need to drastically reduce our consumption of the 3 components that raise it: trans fat, saturated fat, and dietary cholesterol. Once a common ingredient in processed foods in the United States, trans fat-laden, partially hydrogenated oils have since been effectively banned in the country and restricted in dozens of others around the world. These days, in 3/4 of the countries surveyed, most exposure to trans fats now comes from meat and dairy. Cholesterol-raising saturated fat is found mostly in animal products and junk foods. Dairy, including pizza, is our top source of intake in the United States, followed by chicken, then pastries, pork, and burgers. Dietary cholesterol is found exclusively in animal-derived foods, and overwhelmingly eggs are our number 1 source. Chicken is our second leading source, followed by beef, dairy, and pork. It is therefore no surprise that the core dietary recommendations from the leading scientific societies of cardiology for cardiovascular disease prevention is to, quote, emphasize the consumption of plant-based rather than animal-based foods, unquote. Randomized controlled trials involving more than 50,000 people have shown that cutting down on our saturated fat intake leads to a reduction in cardiovascular disease. And the more we decrease saturated fat content, the more our cholesterol drops. The gold standard Cochrane review concluded, quote, to lower risk, population groups should continue to include permanent reduction of dietary saturated fat, unquote. Archie Cochrane was an evidence-based medicine pioneer whose legacy is memorialized in an eponymous nonprofit respected for its high-quality systematic reviews. The American Heart Association got so fed up with quote-unquote butter is back industry attempts to convince people that butter is not harmful that it released a presidential advisory, quote, to set the record straight on why well-conducted scientific research overwhelmingly supports limiting saturated fat in the diet, unquote. The proscription against saturated fat extends to tropical oils, which are often used in junk foods, including coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oil, though animal-derived sources appear to be worse. The Animal and Plant Protein and Cardiovascular Health Trial, or APPROACH trial, randomized people to diets high or low in saturated fats, composed of protein sources from red meat, white meat, or non-meat, bean, grain, and nut. Researchers adjusted the different diets to achieve the same saturated fat intake across all three, tweaking with butterfat for the two meat groups and tropical oils for the non-meat group. Their findings? At the same saturated fat intake, red meat and white meat both elevated LDL cholesterol higher than plant-based protein sources. Red meat and white meat appeared to be equivalently bad, which is the case even in randomized controlled trials that didn't normalize saturated fat levels. Swapping out beef for chicken and or fish does not significantly lower LDL cholesterol levels. Dietary cholesterol has also long been known to be a significant contributor to atherosclerosis. Dietary cholesterol has also long been known to be a significant contributor to atherosclerosis. A 2020 meta-analysis of more than 50 randomized controlled trials found that egg consumption significantly increases LDL cholesterol. Even studies funded by the egg industry show that eggs increase our blood cholesterol. This appears to translate into significantly higher coronary artery calcium scores among those who eat more eggs, which is a sign of atherosclerotic plaque buildup in the arteries, and, most importantly, to a significantly greater risk of heart attacks and death. Based on a half-dozen populations studied in the United States following tens of thousands of people for up to 30 years, each additional half an egg consumed per day was significantly associated with a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease and dying from all causes put together. And this higher risk of death persisted even after taking other lifestyle behaviors into account, including overall dietary quality. In other words, it does not appear to just be because those eating more eggs were eating more bacon. Despite pressure from the egg industry, the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans explicitly told people to, quote, eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible, unquote, as recommended by the Institute of Medicine, advice that was reiterated in the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. Quote, the National Academies recommends that trans fat and dietary cholesterol consumption be as low as possible, unquote, using the rationale that any intake above 0 increases LDL cholesterol concentration in the blood and therefore increases the risk of our number one killer. As noted by J. David Spence, the director of the Stroke Prevention Atherosclerosis Research Center, quote, after conviction for false advertising for suggesting eggs were safe, the egg industry has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince the public, physicians, and policymakers that dietary cholesterol is harmless, unquote. In reality, regular consumption of eggs should be avoided by people at risk of cardiovascular disease, Dr. Spence wrote, which, quote, essentially means all North Americans who expect to live past middle age, unquote. A sidebar, what about Lp(a)? Lipoprotein A, also known as Lp(a), is an under-recognized independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It contributes to coronary artery disease, heart attack, strokes, peripheral artery disease, calcified aortic valve disease, and heart failure. These can occur even without high cholesterol because Lp(a) is cholesterol. It's basically an LDL cholesterol molecule linked to another protein, which, like LDL alone, transfers cholesterol into the lining of our arteries, contributing to the inflammation in our atherosclerotic plaques. For more on Lp(a) and what we can do about it, check out c.nf/LPA and c.nf/LPA diet. In short, Lp(a) blood concentrations are mostly genetically determined, but there are some dietary tweaks that can help. We've known for years that the trans fats found in meat and dairy are just as bad as the industrially produced trans fats found in partially hydrogenated oil and junk food when it comes to raising LDL cholesterol levels. When it comes to Lp(a), though, the trans fat in meat and dairy appear to be even worse. However, merely cutting out meat and following a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet does not appear to be sufficient. There are some specific plants that may help a bit, including ground flax seeds and amla, dried Indian gooseberry powder. When study participants were put on a whole food plant-based diet packed to the hilt with fruits and vegetables, Their Lp(a) levels dropped by 16% within 4 weeks. In those 28 days, they also lost 15 pounds on average, but weight loss does not appear to improve Lp(a) levels, so the researchers figured it must have been the food. In addition to causing weight loss, a month of plant-based eating can dramatically improve blood pressure, even as people cut down on their blood pressure medications. You can also get a 25-point drop in LDL cholesterol and a 30% drop in C-reactive protein, as well as significant reductions in other inflammatory markers for a quote-unquote systemic cardioprotective effect. Vegetarian stroke risk. Healthy plant-based diets have been associated with lower all-cause mortality, with up to a 34% lower risk of death from any cause over an average of an 8-year period. If sustained throughout adulthood, this would translate into more than 4 extra years of life. A meta-analysis of a dozen studies prospectively following more than 500,000 people for up to 25 years similarly found significantly lower heart disease and overall death rates among those eating more plant-based. That's no surprise, a systematic review concluded, given the evidence that plant-based lifestyle programs have, quote, potentially stabilized or even reversed coronary artery disease, unquote. Those eating plant-based tend to be slimmer and have significantly lower LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, blood sugars, and blood pressures, as well as less carotid artery wall thickening and plaque buildup, measured via ultrasound of the neck. Changes in risk factors can happen fast, as evidenced by results from 1 to 3 week ad libitum, meaning eat-all-you-want, plant-based kickstart programs. For example, the nonprofit Rochester Lifestyle Medicine Institute created an at-home 15-day program called Jumpstart. Of its first few hundred participants on a whole food plant-based diet, obese patients lost an average of 7 pounds without controlling portions or counting calories. Diabetics saw their fasting blood sugars drop by 28 points. Those with LDL cholesterol levels over 100 experienced a 33-point drop, which is comparable to some statin drugs, and hypertensive individuals experienced a 17-point drop in systolic blood pressure, which is better than drugs. All this was achieved within just 2 weeks on the diet. If you compare the artery function of those who don't eat meat to those who do, the healthy ability of arteries to dilate normally and let more blood flow is 4 times better among those eating vegetarian, and apparently the longer, the better. The degree of superior artery function correlated with the number of years eating meat-free. Instead of their artery function worsening over time as they aged, it was getting better the longer they ate more healthfully. Studies dating back 35 years show that those eating plant-based also have improved blood so-called rheology, meaning fluidity or flowability, which may play a role in their cardiovascular protection. Subsequent interventional studies putting these cross-sectional findings to the test show that switching people to a plant-based diet can improve rheology measurements within just 3 to 6 weeks. Might the blood of vegetarians flow a bit too well, though? A study of thousands of British vegetarians found that they were at higher risk of hemorrhagic stroke or bleeding stroke. But the 12-part video series I produced on vegetarians and stroke risk triggered by the study, starting with c.nf/vegstroke, was in vain. Since, as I note in c.nf/stroke update, 6 subsequent studies found that, if anything, there's a lower stroke risk among those eating more plant-based. Low-carb diets are low lifespan diets. While those eating plant-based appear to enjoy lower risk of cardiovascular disease and longer lives, those eating low-carb diets suffer significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease and shorter lives, a 22% increase in overall mortality risk. So the side effects of low-carb, ketogenic diets may not only include, as a recent review recited, quote, chronic fatigue, nausea, headaches, hair loss, reduced tolerance to alcohol, reduced physical performance, heart palpitations, leg cramps, dry mouth, bad taste, bad breath, gout, or constipation, unquote, but premature death as well. Low-carb diets have been found to worsen heart disease and impair artery function within just 3 hours of eating a meal rich in saturated fat. Even from a plant source like coconut oil, there's a significant impairment of artery function. Artery function worsens on a ketogenic diet even after about a dozen pounds of weight loss, and this appears to be the case with low-carb diets in general. Lower-carb diners also suffered significantly higher risk of dying from cancer. This could be due to higher IGF-1 induced by higher animal protein intakes, as I talked about before, or perhaps even greater industrial toxin exposure. 90% of persistent pollutant exposure comes from foods derived from animals. So it's no surprise that those eating diets that are lower in carbohydrates and higher in protein have higher levels of pollutants circulating throughout their bodies, including mercury, lead, PCBs 118 and 153, DDE from DDT, trans-nonachlor, a component of the banned pesticide chlordane, and hexachlorobenzene, a banned fungicide. Mediterranean diet scores have also been correlated with elevated levels of PCBs, 118, 126, 153, and 209, trans-nonachlor, and mercury, presumably due to the focus on fish consumption. A fish tail. Thanks in part to the American Heart Association's recommendation that people who are at high risk for heart disease should ask their doctors about omega-3 fish oil supplementation, fish oil pills have exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry, yet the most extensive systematic assessment of the evidence found that increasing the intake of fish fats, EPA and DHA, had, quote, little or no effect on deaths and cardiovascular events, unquote. Longevity experiments on mice found no benefits for aging or lifespan either. Where did we even get this idea that omega-3 fats in fish and fish oil supplements were good for you? I review the whole saga in c.nf/fish oil and discuss contaminants, rancidity, and the 5 massive new trials that have been published, randomizing tens of thousands of participants to various formulations of fish oil versus placebo. It's possible some fish oil formulation will eventually prove to be helpful, but for now, meta-analyses, quote, unequivocally demonstrate that there is no cardiovascular benefit, unquote, to over-the-counter fish oil supplements. Swamp meat. What about simply eating fish? In population studies, it's hard to separate the effects of fish consumption with attributes of fish consumers. People who eat fish tend to smoke less, exercise more, be in a higher socioeconomic class, and eat fewer prepared meals, more organic foods, less high-fat dairy and meat, more vegetables, and fewer sweets. When researchers try to tease out some of these other factors, most studies on fish consumption show no association with cardiovascular mortality. However, one of the key questions that always needs to be addressed in nutrition studies is, instead of what? For example, are eggs healthy? Compared to sausage links? Yes. Compared to oatmeal? Not even close. In this way, the inclusion of seafood in the diet may displace foods that are even less healthy. Surprisingly, randomized controlled trials show that fish is even worse than red meat when it comes to LDL cholesterol, so fish may be worse than beef, but it's still better than bacon. Harvard researchers found that when it comes to sources of protein and the risk of premature death, processed meat was the worst, followed by eggs, whereas plant protein sources were the best. In essence, they found that eating tuna salad was better than egg salad or a BLT, but a bean burrito beat out the bunch. When it came to all-cause mortality, plant protein beat out every type of animal protein, red meat, chicken, fish, dairy, or egg. Swapping red meat for white meat, such as poultry or fish, would not be expected to significantly reduce mortality rates, but something like swapping chickpeas for chicken would. Swapping in just 3% of calories of plant protein in place of any source of animal protein was associated with a significantly lower risk of all-cause premature death. A sidebar: disappearing act. Since heart disease is our #1 killer, it's the primary determinant of how long we live. Bill Castelli, longtime director of the longest-running epidemiological study in the world, the famous Framingham Heart Study, was once asked what he would do to reverse the coronary artery epidemic if he were omnipotent. His answer, quote, have the public eat the diet described by Dr. T. Colin Campbell, unquote. In other words, he told PBS, if Americans ate plant-based enough, the whole heart disease epidemic would, quote-unquote, disappear.